All right, in this video, we're going to get the first sort of view into writing a complete implementation of a feature using RxJS. So let's go ahead and get started. Just a side note, I do have my watch task running. I do have my web server running, and you can read the README on how to do that. So I'm going to start off by jumping over here into our example 01, and I'm just going to copy and paste it. And then I'm going to rename it to example 02 RxJS _AC. And of course, make sure that you change the script that it runs into. And we'll also say autocomplete Rx here as well. Now change the script that it runs. The script is going to be called the same thing as the HTML page. It's going to be example 2 RxJS AC.js. And I'm going to take this file name and I'm going to copy it. I'm going to jump over into my source client. I'm going to right-click, new file, and I'm going to paste that in here. So now we have that running. I'll go ahead and alert hi out there. Refresh my web server and scroll down and click on our RxJS autocomplete, and we do get our hi. So everything is working. All right, for the first step is going to be the same thing as the last application. So I'm going to import money from jQuery. And I'm going to say const title equals money hash title, and const results equals money hash results. I am also going to grab our get items function. Our get items function doesn't change between these examples because we're just simulating a network request right here, and so it doesn't really matter what that does as long as it returns a promise. Okay. So the first question is how do we import reactive extensions? Well, there's a handful of ways to import reactive extensions depending on how you're working with it. You can import reactive extensions piecemeal if you want, just grab the features you want, or you can go ahead and import the whole bundle. The whole bundle actually doesn't include everything. There are a couple things you can optionally require in. For this series, I'm not going to talk about importing it piecemeal. I'm just going to talk about importing the complete base reactive extensions library. And to do that, we simply say import Rx from RxJS Rx. So the capitalization is significant here. Now remember, this is an import statement. We can name the thing we're importing whatever we want, but the convention is a capital R followed by an X. I recommend you follow that convention because that's been established by all the documentation and in fact all of the examples I've ever seen of reactive extensions being used. And what we're doing is we're importing from the RxJS module. Remember, we installed that earlier. And so if I open up my node modules, we can go ahead and locate that guy wherever he is, RxJS. And then we're importing inside of that module, because there's a slash, the capital rx.js file. So this is the file that this import statement will bring in. Okay. So the first question is, we're going to go through the exact same steps that we went through with the last example. What was the first thing we did? Well, the first thing we did was we bound to an event, and then we subscribed to it, and then we queried the items, and then we showed the results. So in reactive extensions, how do we bind to event? Remember, everything is a database. Everything can be monitored, observed, transformed, and subscribed upon. So how in reactive extensions do we go about getting an event? Well, the answer to that is simply rx.observable.fromEvent. And then I'm going to pass in the element, and then I'm going to pass in the event. So what this is going to do, this is going to take the key up event on this element, and it's going to return a observable stream of the key up event. And for the purposes of this particular example, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put that into a variable. So I'm going to say, what am I going to call this? I'm going to call this keyups equals Rx observable from event title keyup. So notice how I put the money symbol on the right-hand side. That's a convention I use to represent an observable object, just how I put it on the left-hand side to indicate that it's a jQuery object. And I find that really helps with the readability of the code when you're working with so many observables and you need to know if a variable is an observable or not. So what can we do with observables? We now have a observable. We have a database, a stream of events. Remember, it's all a stream of events. What can we do with it? Well, we can do a lot of things, but one of the main things we're going to be doing with it is subscribing to it. So if I do keyups.subscribe, and then I can say e goes into, I now have access to the event. That's it. I can even go ahead and console log out, go ahead and save. And then as I type here, notice how these events are getting printed out. So let's go ahead and perform our query. So I'm going to say get items e.target.value, and then I'm going to say .then items goes into, and I'm going to simply say results empty results.append items.map r goes into money li text r. So basically what we have here is exactly what we started off with in the last video. So I go ahead and do that, and we'll notice we finally get those results. Of course, they are not coming in order, and we're having the exact same issues that we had before. So let's go ahead and fix that first issue. So we see that we've gained nothing by using reactive extensions yet, but now let's start using features of reactive extensions to do the thing that we wanted to do. First of all, I want to fix the issue with non-character input. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another stream. I'm going to say const queries, that's not how you spell queries, queries equals key ups dot distinct until changed. Or whoops, I'm going to want to do keyups.map, e goes into eTarget.value, distinct until changed. And we can go ahead and format this a little bit better so it's a little clearer. So now what I've done is I've created a transformation on this original stream of events. I've extracted out the value by mapping the event to the value. So up until this point, we're getting event objects. After this map, we are getting a stream of text. And then we're saying distinct until changed. And that's a jQuery. That's a reactive extensions operator. As a map is also an operator that returns a new observable stream with that operation applied. And the distinct until changed, it is very self-describing. It simply will only produce a value if that value has changed from the previous value. So that's a very, very easy way to represent this logic. So now, instead of subscribing on key ups, I'm going to subscribe on queries. And now, queries no longer gets an event, it now gets a query. And now we no longer have to do eTarget value because that's already been applied to the transformation. So now if I go ahead and hit save and type in my query, notice how when I hit up and down and left and right, the text never changed. The query never changes, and as a result, we don't get a requery. By the way, where I'm looking at is I'm looking at the console. So if I ever type in anything here, notice how we don't get any more values. So now let's fix the issue where every single one of these queries is resulting in a new query. Every single one of these pieces of text that added to our text box is resulting in a completely new query. That's a problem. So how did we fix that before? What exactly is the problem that I'm referring to? Well, we fixed it before by introducing all of this nasty clear timeout, set timeout, and last timeout. All of that code, which is, you see, it's scattered through the entire implementation of our autocomplete. All that code, to make it work, needs a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there. And as you know, when you start doing that, the result is you end up with unmaintainable programs. So how do we fix that? How do we represent this entire bit of logic in reactive extensions? Well, I'm going to come here to my queries, and I'm going to chain one more operator on. And I'm simply going to say debounce 500 and save. And that's it. That's literally it. I can come over here and I can say hello. Whoops. I'm going to leave this in the video because this has happened to me a couple of times. They changed the name of debounce in Reactive Extensions 5 to debounce time. There is also still a debounce operator, but it behaves differently. Debounce time is the operator that will perform our behavior that we want with a time parameter. So now if I come over here and say hello world, notice how it says querying hello world, but it takes 500 milliseconds for that to happen. So while I manipulate the text box, those queries are not coming in. So we've effectively taken this whole stream and we've made it so that it'll only produce a result if a new result has not come in 500 milliseconds. And again, now we have very, very declarative code, and I think that's awesome. But let's go ahead and change our debounce time to 250 so we can find out the last big problem that we have right here. And that's going to be, so if we do hello world, notice how we're getting a bunch of these results streaming in. So how do we fix that in the last one? On the last one, we went ahead and we made an rQuery ID. So we only produced the result if the query ID that was submitted was the one that the result is responsible of. Again, here's another example where we have a line of code here on line 8, a line of code on 20, and 2 lines of code on 23 and 24 to implement one feature. So how would we do that in reactive extensions? And this brings up one of my favorite sort of aspects of reactive extensions, one of my favorite set of operators, the whole flat map select many thing. We can actually roll this whole concept of get items into our observable pipeline. Now, why is that important? That's important because we can now operate on in the context of how long it takes for get items to return a result. Reactive Extensions has built-in support for handling promises. So as a result, we don't have to change the implementation of get items whatsoever to roll get items into our query's observable. So how do we do that? Well, I'll start off by a simple example that won't fix our problem, but it'll be very close to fixing our problem. After debounce time, I'm going to say dot, and then I'm going to do merge map. Query goes into get items query. Now, of course, since we're saying query goes into get items query, we could have replaced this simply with merge map get items. So we're passing in the function as a whole, and then when merge map goes to apply this function, it'll pass in the query to the first parameter. So that cleans up our code substantially. Merge map is an alias for flat map. I talked about flat map before. They in Reactive Extensions version 5, they made merge map the real method, and then flat map remained as an alias. In the past, it was known as select many, and select many you might be familiar with if you're familiar with C# and LINQ. So now that we've merged map get items, and I'll talk about what merge map does in a moment here, but we have to fix our code. The get items call is now a part of our observable pipeline. So as a result, when we subscribe to this observable, we're no longer getting the query because we've taken the query and we've mapped it or turned it into the result of get items. So now what subscribe gets is a list of items, which means we can nuke literally all of that code, and what we've ended up with is a single level indentation method that does what it did before. So we've already, again, we're cleaning up the code substantially. I'll go ahead and save this code out and show you guys that it works. So you see it does work. We are getting our queries and all that's awesome. Notice how we're getting a bunch of, we're having an issue where queries are being, results are being applied out of order. We'll fix that in a moment here. Let's talk a little bit about merge map. Merge map invokes a function. And to make this example clear, I'm going to go into the longhand form of this. I'm going to say merge map query goes into get items query. What it does is it passes in the thing that's the current item that we're looking at, the current item that got pushed to us through our pipeline. And then it calls our callback. And our callback can go ahead and return a observable sequence or a promise or a couple other things. And then all of those items, all of those observables and promises will be merged into the stream. So in fact, merge map can make it so that we returned multiple items. We're going to talk a whole lot about merge map in a later video, but I kind of wanted to give you guys an idea of what's going on here. We're basically forking, you can think of this like forking the pipeline. We're saying, okay, go ahead and get our key ups, extract the query, distinct until changed, so only go beyond this point if the item changed, debounce by 250 milliseconds, and then we're forking the query over and we're saying, okay, now get items. We're going to query get items, but we're only going to produce a value when get items is done, and the value that we're going to produce is whatever get items returned after an asynchronous amount of time, after this window.setTimeout, after this promise gets resolved. Okay, so we still have that problem here where things are coming out of order. How do we fix that? Well, we're not going to use the merge map operator. We're going to use the switch map operator. Now, switch map used to be known as flat map latest. Now, switch map is virtually identical to merge map. Switch map is virtually identical to switch map. The difference is that switch map, if a new query comes in, if a new item comes down the pipeline, before whatever thing was returned by our callback function, by our transformation, discard the old data. So switch map will only produce values from the final result of providing the first thing that completes after a new item came in. So now if I come over here and start typing hello, notice how I'm not getting any results until, wait for it, until the final query comes into play. And that's switch map. Okay, I wrote this code a little bit differently than I normally would for the purposes of kind of breaking things up. But we could actually perform all of these operations and chain them and make our code a lot cleaner. So now that hopefully we're kind of starting to get an idea of the power of reactive extensions, even if some of these operators or concepts are still a little nebulous. But I'll go ahead and comment this out. And I want people especially to follow along with this part, because this is how we're going to be writing a lot of our queries. I'm simply going to do Rx Observable from event title key up, and then I'm going to start a pipeline. And I'm going to start a method chaining pipeline, like how you would do with link, or how you would do with Lodash or jQuery. And I'm going to say map e goes into e target value distinct until changed debounce time. Let's do 500 this time. Switch map get items, and then subscribe results goes into results clear, and then results append results. Let's call this items to be more consistent. Items map I goes into li dot text I, and there you go. Let's go ahead and also remove, take this variable timer down and put it to 2 seconds so we can see things a little bit more in real time. So if I go ahead and type in hello, we get an error because results clear is not a function, it's results empty. That was my bad. So we get hello, and we get our results, and then world, and then we get our results. That's it. So that is the example. This is kind of the most common example of reactive extensions. It literally is. You'll see this example everywhere, but it really captures what we can do with the synchronous or reactive pipelines. So we can compare the code here. So we have all of this code, and it's been rolled into this. And let's talk about the differences here. First of all, this has no external state. We don't have any external state. Everything depends on the thing above it. With this, we have external state that can be manipulated, state that can go stale, state that can go into an invalid format and cause some piece of our code to fail in a place that we weren't anticipating it to fail. So with this, we don't have any state. Also, this is completely declarative. We're literally describing what we want to have done, but we don't have to tell the computer how to do it. Whereas in this case, we have to tell it to set timeouts and clear timeouts and all that fun stuff. Here we just say, okay, we want the value, distinct until change, debounce time, switch map, and then subscribe on those items. And that's it. Now, there's probably a lot of confusing things about this, like subscribe. What does subscribe mean? When does the event get hooked into, and when does it get hooked off? When is the add event listener and remove event listener being called? Some other things like what really happens when we call .map? What's returned? How does it work? What does the source code look like of .map, for example? And so on and so on. So there's a lot of questions that you might have, and those are things we're going to be exploring in this series. But again, this video is entirely about the motivation. Even if these concepts are nebulous, you can see quite clearly the difference in quality of code as well as size of code by these two approaches. Anyway, I think that wraps up our motivation section. So the rest of the series is going to be talking about what's going on here. How does this stuff all work? In the next section, we're going to be talking about observables, subscriptions, operators, and subjects. So the core concepts of reactive extensions. And we'll see you guys then.